Good morning, everybody. This is Jenny Sigler with the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the presentation, A Case Study for Planning a Response to Victims of Mass Violence. And I'm going to turn things over to Krista Flannigan, who's an OVC consultant for us.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Krista Flannigan, and I am a consultant with the ICPTTA program, which I'll talk to you about in just a second. I have been working in response to incidents of mass violence for a very long time, over 25 years, I'm sort of embarrassed to say, and have had experience in a variety of responses across the country, including the one we're going to be discussing today in Aurora. I'm joining you today, though, from Tallahassee, Florida, which is now where I live, and I teach at Florida State University. I'm in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice when I am not working on planning and response with OVC for incidents of mass violence and terrorism. Cassidee, would you like to take a second to introduce yourself, and then Steve?
Good morning. I'm Cassidee Carlson. I'm currently a commander with the Aurora Police Department in Colorado. And in 2012, I was serving as the public information officer when we experienced the theater shooting.
Steve?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name's Steve Redfearn. I spent 22 years with the Aurora Police Department, and just recently, about a month and a half ago, retired and started a new chapter as the deputy chief with Boulder Police Department here in Colorado. The night of this incident, I was a sergeant working on the street and was one of the first supervisors on scene of this incident, which we'll talk about.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Before we get started, we'd like to have a couple of polls. We just want to kind of get a feel for who's here in the audience. So if we could pull those up, please.
All right, everybody, if you could go to your polls module on the left-hand side of your screen, there are two polls that have been enabled for you, so you can click on the icon to open up that poll, and then you can vote now on your response.
Great. I was looking at the results from the first poll, and it looks like that we have a representation from a lot of different areas: victim advocates, some behavioral health providers, law enforcement, victim compensation, and nonprofit. And then we've got the elusive other group. So that's great. Thank you. And then the second poll, we are seeing that some of you have had experience in responding to incidents of mass violence, but there are many of you that have not. All right, thank you so much for responding to the polls. Could we go ahead and go to the next slide? All right, so I just want to tell you a little bit about this project that we are all consultants for today. That this is the ICPTTA project, which is a shortened version called, it's the Improving Community Preparedness Training and Technical Assistance Project, which is, like I said, it's a much shorter name for a project that's the title's much longer. But this is a project by the Office of Victims of Crime operating under the Department of Justice, because they have recognized the need for improving the capacities of communities to deal with the increasing amount of criminal mass violence and domestic terrorism. And there have been several gaps that have been identified that leave individuals and communities affected by these incidents at risk. So to mitigate these risks, a comprehensive plan to care for victims following community mass violence or domestic violence incidents, it's really recommended that these plans be developed and be a part of the overall emergency operations plans for communities and organizations. It's not to replace plans, but it's just to enhance existing plans. So the ICPTTA program, which is funded by the Office of Victims of Crime and directed by the ICF Corporation, along with 4 national partners, and a bunch of subject matter experts from emergency management and victim services are a part of this project. And the components to augment the emergency plans are to make sure that victims, families, as well as first responders are cared for following these incidents, that partners are involved from the local, state, and regional, as well as tribal jurisdictions across the country, and to incorporate these plans into existing exercise structures and calendars. What we've seen is that there are a lot of communities that do tabletops and active exercises, but don't necessarily incorporate the victim services components to it. The ICPTTA also provides individualized training and technical assistance. So after today's training, if you feel that your community would benefit from creating a plan, that you can contact ICPTTA, and we will give you that information at the end of the presentation today to help you put together a plan with the assigned consultants that are available. ICPTTA also has 16 best practices for putting together your plan, and they are here for you to see. So that a plan to be very comprehensive should include, is recommended, all of these 16 best practices. But we've seen that some communities may start with one or two because it can seem a little bit overwhelming, but that ultimately that it would be comprehensive to include all of these areas, all the way from incident command to the different assistance centers, which we'll briefly discuss today, and in victim identification, financial management, etc. And again, technical assistance and training is available for you free of charge through ICPTTA. Next slide, please. So the goal of our webinar today is to introduce the importance of creating a comprehensive plan to respond to victims of mass violence using the example of the lessons learned from the Aurora, Colorado theater shooting. And as you heard in our introductions, all of us had various roles with this response. Mine was more the victim response and also a little bit of the PIO component as well, but that was really what Cassidee was doing. Now, Aurora did not have a victim response plan when this shooting occurred. Upon reflection, while the response was successful in a number of ways, a major takeaway was that establishing partnerships and creating a plan prior to having to respond to an incident of mass violence is really most beneficial for victims, the community, and responders as a whole. Next slide. As we get started, there are just a couple of definitions because we talk about mass violence and terrorism all the time. So what does that mean when we discuss that? Well, mass violence, by the definition from the Office of Victims of Crime, is a little bit different than maybe what you'll see with the FBI. Mass violence from OVC is an intentional violent criminal act that results in physical, emotional, or psychological harm to a sufficiently large number of people. So what I want to point out here is you don't see that there is an actual number that's attached to this, and fatalities are not a requirement for something to be considered an incident of mass violence under OVC's definition. And really it looks at, when we talk about a sufficiently large number of people, what is that? Well, it really depends on where it occurs and in what size the community is and what kind of resources that they may have that's available. Now, domestic terrorism are really activities that really are looking at the intention of the incident, that it is a threat to human life, obviously in violation of laws of the United States, but looking at the intention is intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence policy, or to affect the conduct of a government. So with domestic terrorism, we know more what the intent is, where with mass violence, we don't always know, and sometimes never know what the intention is, what the reasoning is that the perpetrator has in committing those acts. Now, why are these definitions important? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is you have to look at, depending on how the incident is defined, would be who's in charge, what's the jurisdiction. If it's an incident of domestic terrorism, it's always going to be under the purview of the federal government, so their chain of command and their rules have to be followed. With incidents of mass violence, it could be local control, but depending on the incident, if it is a mass violence that involves a bombing, that automatically will bring in the FBI. But a lot of times it is going to be local jurisdictions that will be in control. And this also impacts what resources will be available. So if you have federal resources or state resources, and in some cases of mass violence, sometimes that some of the federal resources, for example, with the FBI, that they usually do show up to provide support for incidents of mass violence, even if it isn't a federal crime, because they are wonderful with some of the property return and property cleaning, that they are a great resource. And sometimes they have some of the emergency funding resources that could be available as well. It's also important when you are putting together your plan about how you define victim in each of these categories. Because you want to think about when is it that you would activate a plan. So for example, with mass violence, what we know from the research is that the majority of incidents of mass violence are the result of domestic violence. And for purposes of OVC, Office of Victims of Crime, and some of the resources that they have, which would be through the Anti-Terrorism Emergency Assistance Program, which helps provide funding resources to communities in the aftermath of an incident. If it's an incident of domestic violence, generally those funds would not be available to help support a community. But that doesn't mean that your community wouldn't activate your plan. So you just need to make a determination as you're putting together your plan. Are you going to be putting a number on it? Is it going to be domestic related? Is it going to be only random acts of violence, etc.? Let me give you just a word of caution here too, that about looking at the definition with OVC, maybe about not having a fatality number, like in going with the FBI, is because sometimes you can have an incident where you don't have fatalities. So there is an example of a school in Virginia that was a high school that was having an event that was in their gymnasium, and some kids were held hostage, the whole gymnasium. So we're talking a couple of thousand students that were in this gymnasium, and they were held hostage for several hours. Fortunately, nobody was killed or injured, but that they did activate and implement all of their plans because the resources were needed, and he had the psychological impact. Next slide, please. Now we're going to be talking about putting together a plan, looking at all of the different phases of response. We always talk about before having an incident, and as I mentioned with our goals, one of the things that Aurora said was, wow, we should have had a plan ahead of time, and a lot of communities do. I have never been to a community so far that has had a victim response plan in place, and so that's the mission of this project. But you're looking at a plan that will cover all of these phases. Usually communities do have plans in this acute phase. So when the incident occurs, that there are plans about where people are going to go, how information is going to be disseminated, etc. But it's after the bodies have been taken to the morgue and the hospital, what do we do? What happens in the intermediate and long-term phases? And where does victim response fit in each of these phases? So even though communities often do have emergency response plans for the acute phase, sometimes victim services is not a part of it. So what we recommend in your planning and looking at your 16 best practices would be that looking at a plan related to your information and notification center. And this is one of these, it's a spontaneous location where victims are given information, and victim advocates would be there to do that. In the immediate and transitional phase, which is typically up to the first remembrance date. And let me just talk here just briefly about words and how important words are. That when we talk about remembrance date, that oftentimes we hear people look at annual events as an anniversary. And we are really trying to get away from that kind of language, because anniversary oftentimes means a celebration. And when we are marking an incident that occurs, that we're certainly not celebrating it. It is more of a commemoration and a remembrance. So the transitional phase is usually up to that 1 year mark, or it could be longer, which could be maybe to the completion of a prosecution phase. And in this time that there will be a family assistance center, which is where you find your victim services, also a community resiliency center. and a hospitality center. We'll talk more about these later in the presentation as to what these are, but that's where you're going to find your victim services. In the longer term recovery, which can be after that 1 year, and depending on when your prosecution occurs, because there are some that it might be a few years before they begin. Excuse me. And if there has been a prosecution, your appeals, parole, penalty imposition, the ongoing memorials and dedications, and I have the anniversaries word here, and it should be remembrances. And during this time, you might have your hospitality center as well as your community resiliency center. And even after an incident, even if you have a plan, it's important that you revisit your plan to see what your lessons learned are, where you felt that you were successful, and what areas might need improvement. Next slide, please. We know, because there have been so many incidents of mass violence, unfortunately, over the last 25 and 30 years, that there are some common elements, some established factors, some things that we know that are going to happen. Now, this is not to say that every incident is not unique, because they are. Every incident is unique, communities are unique, populations that are impacted present unique situations and circumstances. But there are some takeaways that we have from every incident, and that we like to share. So those are part of our lessons learned, and that's where our best practices come from. So we know that there are going to be multiple victims. So what does that mean? That means you're going to have a broad range of different types of trauma reactions. Not everybody is going to experience trauma the same way just because they have a shared experience of the actual incident. There's also going to be a multiple agency response. Well, yes, of course, but this might also mean multi-jurisdictions will be responding as well. Because if you have something that's the size of the Aurora Theater shooting, one law enforcement agency is not going to be able to do the complete response. And so they have to call on other agencies, neighboring agencies, to respond. And you're looking at people outside of the traditional responses. Some of your business community and schools will also be impacted. Also looking at that normal resources, agency resources, are going to be overwhelmed, and that's why it's important to call on some of the support agencies around to be able to enhance the services, and to make sure, and what we've seen in every single incident, that there has been responder vicarious trauma. And we can talk about the broad list of responders, but it's your traditional law enforcement, EMTs, firefighters, etc. But you also want to be looking at your victim advocates, your dispatchers, mental health providers, your Good Samaritans, businesses, military, National Guard, etc. Anybody who has been is working in any phase of this response, any of the phases at all, could be subject to vicarious trauma. So what we've learned is that it's important that plans include how to address this in both the short and the long term. We also have seen that in the last 30 years that the increase in copycat incidents, it used to be an urban legend, really, that when you publicize incidents of mass violence or crime at all, that there are copycats. But now, in this day and age of 24/7 media coverage and access to the internet, that it's real. Copycats are real, and certainly the threat of other incidents does increase following these incidents. We also see following these incidents that there are conspiracy theories, and that you can Google any incident of mass violence and terrorism, and you will find that there's a conspiracy theory. Some have what we call legs, more mainstream media legs than others, and that can exacerbate the trauma of victims. So being aware of that and preparing the community for that, and working with victims with that can be helpful. We know that with these incidents, there's intense media coverage. They're going to be there. Sometimes they're there even before the responders are. And as a result of all of this too, that communities, not just the responders, are going to be vicariously traumatized. And as a result of that they need a way to cope with that, so that there is an outpouring of their emotions. So you see these public memorials and vigils that'll occur, these spontaneous memorials, where people will bring teddy bears or put up crosses, etc. People will donate money, goods, services, etc. So that's part of the way that a community addresses their trauma, because they're trying to make some sense out of what has happened. Next slide, please. All right, Steve, if you want to go ahead and start us off and talk about the incident.
All right, thank you. So as Krista said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of what happened and some of the things that we experienced. Just, I think it's important to give some context on the incident itself, because there are some common themes, and as Krista just mentioned, there are some similarities between a lot of these incidents that we're seeing around the country. Before we do that, we put this slide in here just to give everyone a heads up. We're going to talk about some things that occurred on the initial response. We're not showing any graphic photos or anything, but there are a couple 911 calls, and if you've responded to or been involved in an incident such as this, it may bring back some difficult memories. So just a heads up on that. Next slide, please. So it's been a little while, but I think a lot of the lessons are still very applicable, and that's why we're still talking about it. At the time of this attack, this was the largest mass shooting in U.S. history. Sad to say, obviously, that that didn't last that long. We've had several other large mass shootings, quite a few since then. This occurred on the night of Thursday, basically Thursday, July 19th into the morning of July 20th, 2012. Very nice, warm summer night in Aurora. I'll talk more about it. Next slide, please. So this night, our attacker chose to target the release of Batman: The Dark Knight Rises. We believe he did this because he knew that it would be a well-attended event. We estimate, so there's two different theaters that are involved in this. Theater 9 is the main theater where he was in the theater himself. Some of his rounds went into Theater 8, and so I'll talk about some of the things that created, but the theater estimates 350 to 375 people in that theater the night of the attack. Of note, and I'll talk about a little bit more, but if you look at the second point in this, the suspect lived nearby, a few miles from the theater, and we got a 911 call to his apartment about 29 minutes prior to his attack of a loud music complaint. And that will go to my point of having to have a big picture, a view of these types of incidents, because what we're seeing around the country is it's not just a singular event. There's other things that occur like this, and we'll talk more about what he did. If we can play the audio, and then I'll talk about it.
Aurora 911, where's your emergency? I can't hear you. What address? Theater, Aurora, Colorado. I can't hear you. Give me the address again. There's some check. What address? Say it loud. Okay. Do you know how many other people are hurt? I see at least, I want to say 20. I want to say 20 people at least. Okay, in the theater. We have 20 people shot. We have 20 people shot. We're going to need more ambulances. Okay, what I need you to do, Chelsea, is anybody in worse shape than your friend? There's police here now. 23 police with flashlights. Okay, I'll let you talk to them, but you keep.
Okay, so 2 points on this. The first call came into our dispatch center at about 12:38 in the morning. As you can hear on that call, we estimate just in that short time, there's about 30 rounds fired, that the dispatcher at the time wasn't quite clear on what that was. Fast forwarding 9 minutes to the second clip, that's the first time officers were able to enter the theater. We were on scene in about 90 seconds and had the suspect in custody very quickly, which was awesome. However, it took us a while to get into the theater because of some gas that the suspect had deployed. And initially when we arrived, all of the people who were, for lack of a better term, the walking wounded, ran up to our officers, ran up to the first fire truck. And so it took us a while to get to where the most serious victims were located. Next, please. As I mentioned, on the left of your screen, you're going to see this canister. That's an actual canister that he had. He brought two of them with him. He dropped one in the parking lot. And then this one that you'll see here, when he first, let me back up. The suspect had a ticket to the theater. He went in, sat down in the very front, as you'll see a view there. About 38 minutes into the movie, he faked a phone call, went out to his vehicle. You'll see on the right side, he used that little clip to make it so he could come back in and out of that door. The door was not alarmed. When he did that, he came back in. When he went out to the parking lot, he got his ballistic equipment, basically head to toe. He had some sort of body armor, much better than our average patrol officer, even though some of it was not great equipment. He still had a lot of things that we don't have. He got his 3 different weapons, and then that gas. He tossed the gas in front of the theater, down in front of the screen, and then began shooting. Of note on the gas, it does say for law enforcement only. He was able to buy that online. Just something that we found interesting after the fact. Next slide. So just something to look at. Aurora is a pretty big police department, about 750 sworn. The night of this incident, we had about 126 people that responded just from our department. And of note, and the reason that I point this out is that was not nearly enough. Aurora was fairly used to handling incidents on our own. We hadn't had anything to this magnitude, thankfully, but to have 126 people on duty is a lot more than some agencies I know, but that was not nearly enough. So also of note, for our law enforcement people that might be in this seminar, we had many of the first few officers that were on scene were supervisors, sergeants and lieutenants. It just happened to work out that way. And so they found themselves in roles that they weren't necessarily supervising. But we know when these things happen, if you get there, you're going to go in to end the situation. So there's some lessons to be learned from that as well. Next, please. So we did have a lot of help from outside agencies. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The initial response, well, obviously we had a ton of a help call, basically went out to the entire Denver metro area, said, hey, we need some help. A lot of agencies came, and then later we had a lot of help from federal agencies. One of the things that I try to stress when I've done this training to a lot of law enforcement is if you don't have good relationships now with your ATF, your FBI, all of your federal partners, you need to fix those, because it's not the time at 2 a.m. standing in a parking lot to try to fix relationships that you really need help. So we did have a ton of help. Next. So obviously we talked about, I think we had this slide. Are you covering this one, Krista?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. Sure. And we're kind of going to be going back and forth. So what Steve has been talking about has been we're starting the acute phase, is when we were talking about our phases earlier. So remember, this is the incident as it's unfolding, and we'll be talking, looking at the immediate aftermath. And this is where the information and notification center would be set up, where there'll be a victim response. So what we're going to do now is just talk a little bit about this phase in relation to the tactical response, the victim services, and communications. Next slide. And then Steve, if you want to start off with the tactical response, and then we'll take it from there.
Absolutely. So obviously, as we know, that our response to mass shootings and incidents of violence has changed over the years. Obviously, our biggest goal is law enforcement, and no matter what your role or assignment, if you're the first one there and people are being actively harmed, our goal is to neutralize that threat. In this case, the suspect gave up, did not offer any resistance, and was in custody relatively quickly. And then we had to transfer more into a mode of non-law enforcement where we're helping victims and things like that. In this case of note as well, it took us quite some time to determine that we didn't have any additional suspects. And that's quite common. Witness statements, as we know, in traumatic events are not always reliable. And we had a lot of conflicting information. We had law enforcement officers triaging victims, things that we hadn't trained well for. Thankfully, we had a SWAT medic there that was able to help. But we learned in this event that you are going to need a lot of these in non-traditional police response, where you're in more of a help role for victims. We did learn in this case the suspect vehicle was parked right behind the theater. Obviously, we knew from prior events of wanting to harm first responders, going all the way back to the Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta, that was a threat. We had to deal with that, get bomb squad there, and then, as I mentioned, we had a response to the suspect's apartment that turned out to be a very huge problem, and we'll talk more about that.
Thank you. And from the victim services perspective, that there was an information notification center sort of set up, and typically the way this works is that the incident commander is just a way to get people to a location that's safe and secure so that they can get the information that they need, sort of the official information. And in this case, it was initially sort of just in a parking lot kind of across the street. And then it did move to an indoor location, and then into a school. But as I said, because there really wasn't a plan yet that was in place, that it wasn't necessarily as established. But in this information notification center, there were victim advocates that were available to let folks know where people were located if they've been transported to hospitals. Was also just to provide information about trauma. And sometimes in these centers too, that this is where some death notifications will occur. And there's always challenges to doing death notifications with incidents of mass violence, because as people are being reunited with their loved ones, they're going to leave, they're going to disperse, they're going to go home. And it's usually those that are left that people can kind of determine by process of elimination who has a deceased loved one. And there's information about how to, what some of the best practices are related to death notification that we can share with you at another time. But usually within these first 24 hours, that 24 to 48 hours, death notifications will happen. It can take a long time because depending on how bodies are identified. And so sometimes that people don't have their IDs on them, and depending on they might not be able to be facial notification because of the destruction of their bodies. During this time, there's a lot of crisis, that's people that are traumatized, and so having people that are experienced in crisis intervention, which is what happened in this case. And in Colorado, there is a statewide victim networking organizations called the Colorado Organization for Victims Assistance, and they were kind of put in charge of deploying victim advocates and calling them and saying, could you show up to this location? Not every state has that, and so that's something to think about in your planning, how you would put what your deployment process would look like. Cassidee, you want to talk about communications?
Yeah, from the PIO perspective and getting information out to the public, obviously the PIO was notified almost immediately, responded to the scene. And so some of the things that we were considering is getting out information as soon as we could. One thing that was a little bit different from our incident was it was the middle of the night versus some of the things that we're seeing in the middle of the day or at a school. It is very pertinent to get out, accurate information as soon as you can. Just obviously for the people that are, have loved ones at that location. So we a little bit of a buffer in time just because it was the middle of the night, but it was still very important to get out accurate information as we could. So we utilized social media, and that is obviously best practice. Because we were the largest mass shooting at that time, that was a precedent that we set. I quickly realized, I can't answer all these phone calls because the media was already calling us, and I wanted to make sure that whatever information that the media got, that the public got at the exact same time. That was very important to me, that our community knew everything that we were putting out, and it wasn't just going to the media. And I knew that the way to accomplish that was through social media. So some of the things that we had done beforehand is just set up a media only a PIO email, if you will. So it was pretty generic, APPIO@Aurora.gov. And so that's something you can do pre-planned for. And it just helps kind of streamline some of that. Same with setting up additional phone lines, making sure you've got capacity so you can put out numbers to the public if a loved one needs to find somebody that was at the theater or whatever, setting up those phone lines. And I talked about social media, and then obviously preparing a press conference it's very important, getting out in front of the cameras and getting out that information. So those were kind of the things that we were working on from the PIO standpoint during this immediate phase.
Okay, I mentioned a couple of these already, but obviously when we respond to these, we're seeing more sophisticated things that the suspect is doing, and that's causing concern. This guy was unfortunately really smart, and he caused us some significant challenges. We knew that he had thrown some sort of device in the theater. We weren't sure what it was, so we were concerned about that. And we knew he had access to the theater prior. Obviously, this took some time, and Krista mentioned victim identification. We had some concerns because it was very hard to determine based upon the venue itself being a theater. Initially, when we responded, it was dark, the fire alarms were going off, and the movie was still playing. But even then, after that, because of the seating and things like that, it was hard to determine who was a victim and did we have another suspect that might be down. So we had to have the bomb squad do an extensive search inside before we could even begin to try to ID folks. His vehicle was a problem. We had another firearm in his vehicle in the passenger door compartment. And I flat out asked him on scene when I interacted with him, do you have any explosives in your vehicle? We were pulling injured folks out and putting them right on the sidewalk in front of his car. It was the only way we really were able to do it at that time. And I was thinking at the time, if he has an IED in this vehicle, we're going to have some problems. That's when he told me that basically his apartment was full of explosives, which at the time I wasn't sure he was being truthful, but we learned later he was being very truthful about that. Next. So as I mentioned, as you see, the white Hyundai sedan is his vehicle, that handgun in the door passenger compartment. When we contacted him outside the theater, he actually was in possession of a second handgun. He had laid it on the roof of the vehicle. And when the officers confronted him, he was still wearing a gas mask. He gave up immediately, didn't offer any resistance. I'm going to let Cassidee talk about that next part.
Yeah, so we talk about victims learning information from an incident. Ideally, what will happen is they'll learn information as we learn it from a professional, like a victim advocate, somebody in the realm there. However, there's going to be people spread out everywhere, and depending on the number of victims that you have, and you'll see here in a minute, we had quite a bit of victims that were injured and in hospitals. It's unrealistic that they're going to get notification of certain information from a victim advocate or something, or somebody from the police department. Therefore, they're going to be learning this information probably from social media and things that are being pushed out by the agency, the lead agency. And then as far as the public and the neighborhood surrounding the suspect's apartment, we had to utilize things like the reverse 911 system when we talked about needing to evacuate and things like that. So that's again, using that social media was key, trying to just notify everyone that we needed to about information that needed to get out.
Sorry about that. So this is a picture of his apartment. It's nothing significant. However, when we got to his apartment, when he told me that his apartment was rigged with explosives, that's when I also found that noise complaint from about 20 minutes prior, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. That's not a coincidence. The fact that before this attack, likely when he left his apartment, we got a loud noise complaint that was likely meant to bring first responders there, and that's what it was. We arrived, we put undercover officers on the apartment to see if they saw any other suspects. Our tactical team got inside, secured the building, and held on his apartment. What they did is initially looked through his window, and they were able to see a fairly sophisticated device inside. We, at this point, by the time that we were at the apartment, we had all of the victims transported to hospitals that did survive. And then we began now dealing with the second scene in this neighborhood. The good thing is, Cassidee mentioned, it was the middle of the night, but we did have to evacuate several apartment buildings around this when we discovered that large IED in his apartment. Then we had to deal with, luckily it was summer, not winter, but we had to deal with figuring out what we were going to do with a lot of the neighbors and other people there, some of whom were going to be out of their apartments for several days. Next. So Cassidee mentioned, while we had 12 people that were unfortunately killed in this incident, we had 58 others with gunshot wounds, and a lot of those gunshot wounds were fairly significant. We had folks that were shot with a rifle, shotgun, and handgun, and then other people with more minor injuries as well. Next. All right.
Right, so we've talked about that information notification center is where you're going to be finding victim advocates. And in this incident, as I mentioned before, it began kind of where people were gathering in a parking lot, but then was moved to a nearby school gymnasium. This is when looking at that there was victim advocates came. There was a staging area that was immediately set up for media. There was also security that was provided there. And this is where, as I mentioned before, where victims came to get information about where they could find their loved ones, information maybe about some immediate resources that they might have, might be needing, as well as some of the death notifications. Now, information notification centers with any type of response are spontaneous. You can't plan to where it's going to be, because you don't know where your incident is going to occur. And it can also be at several locations depending on the size and scope of your incident. Also, information and notification can be presented or can be given at hospitals too. And so we've seen in incidents such as this one, where you have at a hospital where you've got several victims that are there, that there might be a victim advocate that is stationed there to be the resource for information that they're getting from law enforcement about the investigation, et cetera, as things are becoming available to them. Also, the Information Notification Center is open just for a short period of time, because it's going to transition into what we call a Family Assistance Center, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But this is usually open no more than 72 hours, and that's really on the long end, because this is a location that it can't be predetermined. You don't know about the availability, if it can be available for the next several days. I also want to bring your attention to the terminology here. Again, words matter. That you might have heard about these centers being called reunification centers, where people go right after an incident. And again, this is that language we're trying to get away from, because reunification implies that people are going to be reunited with their loved ones. So if they go to the scene and they're said, hey, go over to the school gymnasium at the reunification center, these families are going to be expecting that that's where their loved one is going to be, and sometimes that is not the case. So information notification is more accurate for victims. Next slide, thank you.
All right, so kind of going back a little bit about communication during these first few hours, one of the most important things that we had done, and we were fortunate in Aurora, we have a very robust victim advocacy program, and we have a pretty large staff of victim advocates. And as Krista mentioned, we did lean on, neighboring partners in that realm. But something we've always involved our victim advocates in is our briefing. So whether it's just a homicide of one person, or which led us to this, which, we're bringing those victim advocates into all of the briefings. So all the investigative briefings, we had the lead victim advocate in, and that's important. And if you don't have that relationship now, I would encourage you to talk to your agency heads about the importance of that. And so we had that established trust between the investigators and the victim advocates. And so everything that was shared in there, the victim advocate would check with the lead investigator, make sure that was okay to share with the families. And then that information was passed on to the victims' families or the victims. And so that was something that we did that worked out really well. Some other things that we did, we talked already about the email, setting that up beforehand, but something that you can do is an automatic reply, like an out of office. So, a bounce back email, so you can draft something to tell people where you want them to go to get that information, telling the media, please follow our Twitter page or whatever medium you're going to use. And then you can also put in the most updated information to bounce back. That's really effective as well. And then we talked about setting up phone lines just to make sure that people can call and know where to go if they are trying to find a loved one, or they need to know where the information notification center is. But another tool that we used on top of our social media was Google Voice. Our PIOs still use that tool. We had it in place beforehand. And I don't get paid by Google, so I won't go into a great spiel, but it is a great tool. And even beyond PIO, I know a lot of our investigative units use it as well. But it allows you can put on a do not disturb, so you can have an automatic, again, voicemail set up, things like that. It transcribes your voicemails when you get them. So it is a great tool that we were able to use during this incident. Sorry. So when you talk about the first few hours, obviously you're going to have a press conference, and probably many press conferences as things progress. Our chief at the time came from New York. He was very media savvy, did an awesome job as far as the realm of media. And he understands that it's important to get out as much information as you can, as long as it's accurate. It's not going to interfere with the investigation. And we are, like many police departments, believe in transparency. And so that obviously that was important to our chief at the time. So we did our first press conference on site at the movie theater in the parking lot, just under 2 hours after the incident. So things that you're considering and that we put out is where you're asking family to go. So have that location determined, as Chris has put that emphasis on that, where that information notification center is. What phone numbers do we want to put out to the public? And then always at the end of a press conference, when to expect the next press conference, when's the next update? And then, like I said before, this is very important. Where can people go for the updates? Where do you want them to go? Where's the best information? This is going to be important, especially if there's multiple responding agency, identifying the lead agency, and then that's where all that information is going to be put out first. Those are important conversations to have in the beginning with all the PIOs that respond from responding agency, is who's the lead and where's that information going to go, and that everybody needs to, what we say, stay in your lane. Very important. After all of our press conferences, we would do bullet points, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. But after our first press conference, we did a press release, made sure it was reflected what the chief said, exactly what the chief said there on stage. And we actually only did 2 press releases for this incident. We did one after this press conference, our very first, and then one at the very end. It ended up being the end for us because we got a gag order, a court order, that we couldn't talk about it anymore. So those were the only 2 press releases that we did. During these first few hours, obviously I knew my partner and I, there was only 2 PIOs assigned from our agency, only 2 of us. And I knew we were quickly going to be overwhelmed and needed help. Much like our state has a statewide victim advocacy group, we also have a statewide PIO group, and very professional group that meets once a month. So we do networking, we do training. I got to know all these people in my years as PIO. So immediately called upon this group to help set up the JIC, the Joint Information Center, and get that ball rolling. And I leaned on them in another capacity that you'll learn here in a few minutes. And I think, so briefings are super important before every press conference. Again, having the victim advocate in there is very important. And then just making sure who's ever speaking, everybody's on the same page. We know what they're speaking about. This is very important if you have politicians, elected officials that want to speak, get them in the room as well. You may not want to bring them in privy to all the investigative information, but at some point before the press conference, bring them in, making sure everybody knows what's going to be talked about, and that important investigative information won't be released. In our incident, we agreed early on with all of the entities, including the elected officials, anybody coming to help us with mutual aid. No entity would do an individual interview. And I think that really set us up for success when you talk about, the public information response. So that was something that we did, and it worked out really well for us. Everybody just stayed in their lane. We were the lead agency, and everybody respected that. And while this slide is up, I will quickly talk about, so when we identified who the shooter was, how the victims were made aware of this information. So if they were still at the information center, victim advocates shared this information with them, in person before we released it in a press conference Friday at 11 is when we released this information. By that point, we had been able to confirm that this is who this individual is. These are the charges. And so we released that information at a press conference at 11 o'clock on Friday. So less than 12 hours after the incident, we were able to pass on that information. Sorry, I guess it's still me. So you talk about victim care, what was happening. Krista's talked about this a lot. So that first 72 hours. So by 4 p.m. on Friday, this is that time where if their loved one was alive, they knew about it. They were either at the hospital with them or they were physically uninjured and were reunited with them. And at this point, 4 p.m., it was at the high school where we were at. It was pretty obvious who was left was going to be the families of the deceased. So this is where we worked with the coroner's office. And as a matter of fact, in the after action report, that was one of the things. I mean, as we spoke, death notifications are always going to be the worst part. They're slow because they need to be. We have to make sure we have the right information. But they were able to do some things. Our coroner's office was able to do some things through some fingerprint scanning and using the driver's license to expedite it. And again, this is 10 years ago. So there might be some technology even now that makes that go a little bit faster. But again, it's got to be the right information. So that's important for the victim advocates to explain that. We have by this point assigned a victim advocate to each family. And then later I'll talk about the assignment of a public information officer to each family. That didn't happen until technically Sunday, but we'll talk about that. And then just the reliance on law enforcement partners for additional staff. Your cops are getting, they've responded to the scene. They're doing scene security, whatever that looks like. So everybody's starting to get worn down, need rest. So getting people replenished and leaning on other jurisdictions. All right, Steve.
Sorry, it was slow to log in. So this incident, as I mentioned, so we had the scene at the theater, which was in and of itself an extensive crime scene. We held the theater for over 9 days, a lot of crime scene processing. We knew in this incident it was a little different than some mass shootings because our suspect was alive. We knew we would have a trial, so we had to do everything to prepare for that. At the same time, we had his apartment, which is in a different side of town and consequently a different county. Our city's in 3 different counties in Aurora, so there was a lot of different challenges there. As you can see, our bomb squad techs were using a fire truck. It was a 3rd floor apartment. When they looked inside on the upper right picture, you'll see the device on the floor. This guy had taken a lot of time to prepare this. He was a PhD student at a nearby university, by all accounts, extremely intelligent guy. And so he had the skills and actually some of the things he used in his device came from the school. He had improvised thermite. He had many devices on the chairs that were filled with homemade napalm and things designed to harm whoever came through that door with a pretty sophisticated backup as well. So this was an ongoing issue for us. We had not prepared for 2 extensive crime scenes. We did end up relying upon our outside agency partners. One thing with the apartment that was beneficial due to the fact that we had a trial was the fact that we were able to get a search warrant and recover a lot of evidence that really helped in not only the trial, but determining that he was legally sane to stand trial. Of note on his calendar on the day of the attack, we found the symbol that he put there. It appears as best we could guess to be the infinity symbol and a number 1. So we were able to show that he was planning this for quite some time. Next. All right.
So what was happening over the weekend as far as the realm of communication? So Saturday, I responded to the scene of the apartment, and we had a command post on scene, obviously, and the emphasis that day was the apartment and the IED threat. During that, I went and briefed media several times, just strictly just on that issue alone. It was important. That neighborhood is, heavily populated. It's a busy area. Our hospital is a stone's throw away from this apartment. So it was important to get that information out to the community as well about what was happening on scene. Then once all the issues were dealt with the apartment, and it was rendered safe. Then we did our last formal press conference Saturday afternoon around 2 o'clock, and followed up with the final press release. And then that was determined at that time that individual entities could do interviews. So on Sunday, so for example, Chief Oates did a national TV interview on Sunday morning, as did our mayor, and different things. So, but we're also continuing messaging about resources, information sourcing, and donations. So that information is still going out. And two things that I failed to mention earlier. It's very important that, and you know, I'm a sworn officer, so I always say, but like if there's some roles that you can grab your admin staff to do, and they'll do an amazing job, and they want to help. And so one of the things that we did is we needed all the phone numbers that had gotten out, whether people were just looking on our website, those voicemail boxes need to be checked, because you have to make sure that there's nobody on there with pertinent information that might have been a witness that had fled the scene, and so or you know, trying to find a loved one. So that those need to be checked in a timely fashion, as does social media. We assigned a social media person almost immediately. That on Friday morning I was able to establish. He happens to be a really good friend of mine, but I knew he was pretty social media savvy, and I tasked him with just monitoring our social media, and he would be the one to put out anything on social media and just monitor it for any misinformation that we needed to correct or anything like that. So this is all just happening all the time, things to consider. So the Family PIO Liaison Program was a brainchild of this incident, and it has become a national best practice. And here's how it came about. So Saturday, when I was at the suspects apartment, the governor was there, and one of the people from his communications team made a comment, and all he said was, you know, one of the things that you can't forget as this goes on is the families of the deceased. And that just really stuck with me, because I knew what I was dealing with as far as the from the media, and I was the professional PIO, and it was stressful. You know, all the phone calls, all the emails, you know, just the media being just eager to get that information. And I thought, well, I haven't suffered a personal loss here. And I just thought about the families and all the grief that they were dealing with, of having a loved one taken from them in such a violent manner. And then on top of that, having to deal with media, trying to get to them for a statement for anything. And I just thought, wow, I knew we had obviously assigned victim advocates to every family of deceased, but I thought that would be pretty cool if we could assign a PIO to just help them navigate. So this program was established to provide a buffer to the media for the grieving families. And again, I leaned on this statewide team of professional PIOs. And so I put out a kind of a all call to that group and said, this is what I'm thinking. If you'd like to assist, show up Sunday morning. And I had a room full of people on Sunday, and I had the victim advocates there as well. And I should back up. I had to obviously clear this through my chain of command, through the investigators, to make sure that, and the DA, because again, we have a case here. So I had to make sure everybody was okay with kind of what I was thinking, and everybody absolutely was. So we got the program up and running on Sunday morning, got PIOs assigned Sunday evening to the families, where they met the families. The advocates who had already established those relationships did those introductions. And so the purpose of the program, that the PIO is not the family spokesperson. That was really important. This person shouldn't be on camera. They shouldn't be making statements. They shouldn't be writing statements. Simply, they're just providing immediate contact to give to the family space to grieve, and then assist and help guide the family in dealing with the media however they wish. So if they wanted to do an interview with a specific station or a specific reporter, that PIO can help navigate that. and they could help share photos, the photos that the family chooses to share with the media. And what we did, we were able to accomplish this by doing, we opened Gmail accounts for each family. So Smith Family PIO at gmail.com. And we did the same with phone numbers, but the email was what everybody went to. And then I drafted a letter that I sent out to all media, essentially announcing the program and how it would work. And the feedback was phenomenal. The media was, the families were very grateful that they had this buffer, but the media was also very grateful that they knew that they were dealing with a professional PIO on the other end, and they didn't have to try to jump out of bushes to try to get a statement from a family member or intercede that way. And they were very respectful of the victims, and knowing that they were, if the victim's family wanted anything out, that would be the means we did it. So it's a very successful program. If you'd like to know more about the logistics behind it, that program, you can follow up with Tara, and we can get you that information.
All right, thank you. And I just want to say a couple things. As Cassidee was talking about with that program, that it's a win-win for everyone, and it's also a great benefit to the victim advocates too, because those of you in the audience who are victim services providers, and with all of media attention with high-profile cases, sometimes you get thrown into trying to intervene with the media, and this type of program is a great partnership, because for this incident, that the victim advocates were able to do their job with being victim advocates and didn't have to be distracted by having to work and intervene with the media. So it's a great model. All right, now we're going to be moving into the intermediate transitional phase, which, as I said, can be up to the 1-year mark. Depending on how quickly the trial occurs, it could be the completion of the prosecution. With Aurora, we would probably be talking about that more in the longer term phase, but for your planning. And where we see victim assistance is with the Family Assistance Center, Community Resiliency Center, and if there's a trial in this phase, the Hospitality Center. So looking at it from the tactical victim services and communications phase in this phase, we'll start with Steve, if you could talk about the tactical response quickly.
Sure. So as I mentioned, this was a very long-term investigation. There was one homicide detective assigned to this case. That was his life for a couple years at least. And this trial actually went pretty quick compared to other large trials. It was in about 3 years. During this intermediate phase, though, we focused on just putting that case together. A lot was going on in those first few days, especially Sunday. We were told the president was coming to town, and obviously, if any of you have seen a presidential visit, it's extremely it's intense for security purposes. At the same time, we actually had a memorial going on as well. So a lot of things going on. You have to just plan for more than several days of extended operations. And all of those things created additional opportunities if someone else wanted to harm people to do that. So we had to make sure, unfortunately, to have a lot of security there.
Great. Hey, Cassidee, do you want to go ahead and talk about communications, and then I'll do victim services?
Yep. So again, the important part here in the immediate phase here that we're talking about is the continual releasing of information about anything that's changing. And again, we had a court order, so I couldn't release information about the investigation, but there's so many things happening behind the scenes about resources being offered. And then now we're starting to see donation sites set up and different things like that. And we all know there's scams happening. And so if you can identify the appropriate or the legit donation site, it's probably not a GoFundMe, it's probably something else, but getting that information out there so that your community knows if they want to donate, where to go. And that was some of the important information that we were pushing out. And again, constantly monitoring that social media. We had some leaks that were happening, and so you need to your investigators rely on you as the PIO to catch that stuff as it shows up in the media. And so we were able to there were some leaks. They weren't detrimental to the case, but just things that you want to stay on top of and make sure your investigators know.
Great, thank you. And from the victim services side was where services were provided still at hospitals, but primarily at a family assistance center, community resiliency center. If we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the family assistance center. So the Family Assistance Center for Aurora was operationalized by Aurora Mental Health, and it was in one of their facilities. Now, for this incident, law enforcement was not involved at the Family Assistance Center. However, we know since then it is the best practice that it be better that they are a presence there to be sure that all witnesses are identified and interviewed. So a Family Assistance Center is something when you're establishing your plan that can be a predetermined location. You could be looking at real estate, every few months to see what might be available for a week or several, maybe a couple of months, depending if it's on something like the scope of a 9/11, that those assistance centers were open up to 3 months. But this is kind of an area, a location where all resources can be provided under one roof. And it is open for extended hours. It's open 7 days a week. From the Information and Notification Center, when it shuts down, Family Assistance Center is going to open up pretty quickly. And there are a variety of resources that can be provided. As we said, law enforcement, it's recommended that there be somebody there so that as there's an intake that's being done to find out what kind of services that people might need. A question that is often asked is, were you a witness to the crime? Have you been interviewed by law enforcement? And if they have, then they can go off into a private secure room and talk with law enforcement to give their statement, and then they can access all of the other services. So this is just an idea of where you can start with looking at services, and again with ICPTTA, that we can help you put together a plan related to a family assistance center. And part of when we look at, we talked about individual trauma that victims experience, and that with multiple victims and it's mass trauma, well, communities are impacted as well. And so we certainly saw that in Aurora, that this, happened in the community theater. And so the community was very traumatized by this. And so we see communities, and Aurora is no exception, that kind of go through that experience of crisis and shock. Can't believe that this has happened. And then there's the sadness where there were multiple funerals that people were attending, and public memorials and public vigils that were happening in the weeks and months following the shooting. The community as a whole would experience some anger and fear, and anger that it happened, anger at officials for allowing it to happen, not feeling safe and secure, calling their public officials to task to say, how can you make sure that this never happens again? We also see in communities that there's kind of this period of this honeymoon where everyone comes together and feels kind of united in the crisis response, and being very victim focused, and kind of this is where we start to identify people that are heroes. But then there is also then a period of disillusionment, because people are feeling like that they should be starting to feel better after a while, and we're starting to see some of this community conflict, because usually agencies, prior to an incident, that there are agencies that there's just some conflict amongst them. It happens, whether it's related to, turf, that, who provides what kind of services, or who knows what it could be, personalities. Well, when an incident occurs, that sometimes that conflict is put to the side for a short period of time, but it eventually comes back, and it sometimes comes back with a vengeance because of it being exacerbated because of the trauma that the community is experiencing. And it's important to know that that's normal. And within your plan is to, how are you going to help resolve that conflict? And sometimes part of the conflict resolution happens in the planning process itself. It's bringing people together to get to know each other in a different way, and to establish relationships and partnerships. And as I mentioned before about the community and public vicarious trauma is one of the established factors. What's important about this is something that Cassidee mentioned, is about these donations that start to come in, and that these are people that will donate services and money, and having a plan in place about what are you going to do with this, because it can take away from the services, because all of a sudden somebody dumps 1,000 teddy bears on your lap. What are you going to do with those? How are they going to be dispersed? Who's going to be in charge of that? Food, perishable food versus non-perishable food. So having a plan for refrigeration, etc. And what are you going to do with excess of that? And money is one of the most challenging aspects of a response, especially in this phase, in this intermediate phase. So having a good resource management plan that's available, and there's actually a webinar that that ICPTTA has that you can reference on their website coming up shortly. Ultimately, what you want to see a community do is be integrated with their trauma, that they no longer identify themselves by this incident. So Aurora, now when you hear Aurora or when you hear about Aurora, Colorado, it isn't immediately associated with the theater shooting, that they, it's something that happened in their community and that they have built some resilience around that. But it's no longer, they don't identify themselves by the incident that occurred. Next slide.
Real quick, these are just what Krista was talking about, some community memorializations that happened in Aurora. So Sunday after the shooting, a large vigil on our city grounds. And then, of course, a memorial was erected right by the theater. And since then, we've had a permanent one built on our city property, a garden, a reflection garden. And one thing I want to highlight when, if the president comes to your community, and as it relates to victims, one thing that's important is you make sure that you check with the victims that they want to be visited by whomever it is that may be coming to visit. We actually had the star of Batman, I forgot his name, but the actor, and coming to visit the hospitals. And you just want to make sure that the victims are okay and want to have that person visit them. It's their choice.
All right, I mentioned the Resiliency Center. We are, coming close to the end of our time, so we're going to be going through this last part of the material pretty quickly. But as I mentioned, the Resiliency Center is, when the Family Assistance Center closes down, it should transition into a Resiliency Center, which will be providing support kind of on a longer term. All of the resources are no longer under one roof, that there will be a navigator/victim advocate that will actually help connect people to the resources that would be available. And in Aurora, that this was located in a closed down retail building within the community. And it's recommended, a best practice is to kind of again predetermine where your resiliency centers could possibly be, something that might be available for 1 to 3 years, that could transition maybe into continuing victim services, or that might end up terminating services after a while, and then those that are still impacted by the incident would be referred out to existing services rather than having a brick and mortar. Also, we've seen, especially in the light of the pandemic, that resiliency center services can be provided virtually too, and that has been something that we have seen in a lot of the larger, really large incidents where you have people that have come to a community for a short term, like the Las Vegas Route 91 Music Festival. That virtual services really were the key way that services were implemented, because a lot of the people did not reside in the Las Vegas area. And again, ICPTTA can work with your community to help you put together a plan for a resiliency center. So as we move into the long-term recovery phase, that we'll be looking at the tactical approach too, but also looking at where victim services will be at a community resiliency center, but also a hospitality center. And I'll just go ahead and say the victim piece really quickly, that we will be talking about, what a hospitality center is, but a resiliency center and a hospitality center can remain open at the same time, because they have different purposes. Hospitality center is focused primarily on victims that want to participate in the trial. Steve?
Sure. So
I'll take this real quick because Steve has the next slide. So as far as communications, the things that are happening now are open records requests that are coming in. Depending on your state's open records request, this is going to be important. You're going to continue to see media requests coming in, wanting to talk to first responders, that kind of thing. And then we'll talk a little bit about recognition of people that assisted, and also donations that are still occurring.
So real quick on this as well. So long-term for us, we had a lot of our employees, not just sworn officers, that were greatly affected by this. So we had to make sure we were taking care of our folks. Our peer support program was good, but we needed to make it better when we did. And we really, it was the first time we'd seen just a really large amount of use of peer support and psych services. There are still people today seeking counseling for this incident, both from the first responder community and just the community at large. We had to prepare for a trial, and I can tell you, going through that myself, that was a very difficult thing to go back and a few years down the road, after things had kind of subsided, and have to kind of relive that and then see the suspect in court. We had to worry about returning property to people. That was a heavy lift as well. And then donation management. I'm not gonna rehash that, but it's something you do not want as a police entity or government entity to really be the lead on. There's a whole piece on long-term first responder recognition we could talk about, but it's especially for anyone who's in a supervisory role, you've got to understand it's going to be a long-term healing process for your department. Next. So a couple things with that. I credit our victim advocates heavily because about a week after this, our lead advocate hit me up and said, hey, some of the people that the officers saved want to meet the officers. And so we spent an entire day going around to different hospitals and reuniting the officers that either rescued people out of the theater or transported them. We transported about 28 people in police cars. We went to the hospital and did that interaction. And so some of the officers still to this day are very close with some of the people that they personally recognize. So it's a little bit much different than a normal day-to-day call. I would highly recommend you doing those things, both for the community and the victims, but as well for the officers. It was a very helpful thing. Next. Again, the 28 people were transported in police cars, and these were people with absolutely devastating wounds. And these officers, some of whom are in this picture, were just incredible heroes, but that does come at a cost. So it was a non-traditional response. However, as we've seen, we've got to get creative in some of these because the traditional police response is not going to always work. So we could talk more about that, but we're short on time. Go ahead, Cassidee.
I just wanted to highlight a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. We were in a position as an agency large enough. The chief assigned a full-time person, one of our detectives, to the chief's office to work on these many things that are just going to continue to need assistance throughout the coming really years. But we were fortunate to have that.
As I mentioned before about a hospitality center that can be run operationalized at the same time that a community resiliency center. And for Aurora, this was located, their hospitality center was in the courthouse itself. We've seen with other incidents where it might be at a community center nearby the courthouse. But this is focused on meeting the victim needs during a trial. And not all victims are going to want to participate in the legal process. And so it is to deal with the emotional healing and debriefing and provide information about what happened that day during trial, and their resources that are provided related to that, as well as media management. Again, that there can be support with your community to help you put together a plan that we'll talk about more details related to this.
Oops, sorry about that. So a lot of the long-term implications of the trial, not only manpower, but just emotional for everyone, as Krista just mentioned. Managing this case was huge. We had over 4,000 items of evidence in this case, many of which were flown back to the FBI for processing. We had to make sure that, just like any other trial, that was very solid because we knew all eyes would be on this. And so remarkably, there was not one discovery violation in this entire process. It was the biggest trial we'd ever dealt with. But we really had to worry about the long term on our people as well. So again, a lot more on that, but overall it was a very successful trial for us. Next. A couple of things on here because it comes up every time we do these presentations. People want to know about the weapons, and this does go hand in hand with the trial. But it was important to go back and piece this together, and what the detectives were able to do with the help of the ATF was to go back and trace all of his weapons purchases. And if you see on May 22nd, he purchased his first firearm basically 2 months before the attack. And so we were able to go back and piece that all together. The picture on the lower right with the red is actually a picture he took himself of his bed the day of the attack, and that's all of the stuff that he took with him there. So it's quite extensive and quite frightening for us. Next. So again, it's weird to say that we got lucky in this incident, but we did, because he took just a massive amount of ammunition to the theater. All in all, he only fired 76 rounds. Say only, but he could have fired, he had well over 2,000 rounds of ammunition. Next. So as this went on, our hopes were we had to get through, and this is very common as well now, but we had to get through phase that determined if he was sane to stand trial. They did that, went through a very long trial, and he was sentenced to 24 counts of murder, 2 counts for each of the 12 deceased, and then a lot more counts for all the people he shot. So he will never see the light of day. He was not given the death penalty, but he will never be a free man again. Next. So victim impact, this is huge. We lost 12 amazing individuals, including a 6-year-old girl. One thing we did going forward, again, a lot of creative people helped with healing in the community as well as healing within the police department. But we were able to find that she at one point, the youngest girl had said that she wanted to be a police officer when she grew up. So in 2015, there was a bake sale for her little classmates had done. And we went down as a department, about 150 of us with our honor guard. And we all took the oath of office in her name and made her an honorary police officer, Veronica Mosier Sullivan. And we were able to give her parents this plaque. It was just a cool thing. And I think it meant just as much to us as it did to the family. So consider doing some of those things in the long term. Next. All right, I think we can, yep. So we did an after action report and we knew that there were things that didn't go great, but a lot of things did go well. The nice thing that we could hang our hats on is the bold and underline is that we achieved the best possible outcome following the shooting. And everyone who had survivable wounds was transported and did survive, which is amazing. Next. Again, 28 people transported in police cars, 20 in ambulances, 12 in private vehicles. And we've seen this now around the country. It's just a different response. Next. So a few areas of improvement that came out. One of the big ones was communication at the scene, and that's any of our law enforcement partners know how difficult that is. Any training that you do on these, you've got to include communication as an integral part of that training as well. Next. Again, with that unified command, having that joint command with police, fire, anybody that represents an entity there at the scene is best practice, and we've really worked to fix that because it didn't go great for us that night with communication. Next.
All right, I'm going to cruise through communications lessons learned. Obviously, social media, harped on it, work smarter, not harder. And then we did frequent media updates through social media. We released a lot of information, which made the media and the public happy. That was due to our police chief in his direction. So I would encourage you to release as much information as possible that won't hurt the investigation. We live streamed all press conferences that were available on our website. We did bullet points following every press conference. That was very beneficial, kept everybody in the Joint Information Center on the same page of what was being released, what could then be released again. Assigning that person to social media because it needs to be monitored all the time. And all PIOs stayed in their lanes and stayed on course. The PIO Family Liaison Program went very well, was a great success. And then we kept track of all of our communications, which was good. And this came up in court. If you'll go to the next slide, we had established this Excel sheet, and that we were able to turn over to the courts and show them every communication that we did. I don't even know why we started doing this, to be honest, but we just did it, and it came into place. So next slide, please. Some areas of improvement. Initially on scene, we were right in the incident command post. So it would have been better if we had a media command post, a PIO command post, a little bit offset, just to give some breathing room to the leadership on scene to run the scene. And then obviously you want to keep media out of the immediate area, but yet give them a vantage point for their footage as well. We were a little slow on setting up the Joint Information Center and the phone numbers that were released. We had some erroneous phone numbers out there, which is just frustrating for people trying to call. And then I would just encourage you to prioritize local media. And they're going to be the ones after the storm. So just if you're going to do exclusive interviews, things like that, just remember that local media. They're the ones that are there after all the national media attention moves out.
All right, with victim services, quickly, what went well? As Cassidee had mentioned, that Aurora Police Department has an incredibly robust and well-trained victim advocate program. So they were able to, be deployed to the scene, but also with the use of the Colorado network, that they were able to deploy volunteers that were trained, and victim advocates that were trained and experienced and knew what the resources and referrals were around the community, and also the advocates working with the PIO liaison program that Cassidee spoke about. Next, areas of improvement. There was a little bit of a challenge sometime with transitioning from the investigation, that acute phase, into the transitional phase, with the handoff from who was the priority victim services provider when the prosecution phase took over, and as other victim advocates were going off to their other communities, that there wasn't really a better plan should have been in place about how to make that transition a little bit more smooth. And there were spontaneous volunteers, people that just showed up that hadn't been vetted, and we didn't know if they had been trained or not. So that's always a challenge to try to figure out where to put them or how to turn them away. As I mentioned earlier, death notifications are always hard in an incident of mass violence, and this was certainly no exception. And the same thing with donation management, that it is always a challenge, but some of those challenges can be mitigated with an effective plan. Next slide. All right, you can just click through this. This is just some examples of some other incidents. We know that Aurora is not the only place that has had incidents. We just wanted to highlight kind of what happened there, but we know that they happen all over the country, all sorts of locations. There's just a shooting at a mall in Idaho this week, and they happen in churches, they happen in all places of worship, they happen in schools, etc. So plans need to be comprehensive, recognizing that they can happen everywhere. We are about out of time, so now we want to talk about really quick about now what do you do? You have all of this, it's time to make a plan. And so what we recommend is this comprehensive victim response plan that is collaborative, and that means working for the mutual benefit of each other for a common goal of being victim focused and serving the victims. Has to be multidisciplinary, has to be comprehensive, and it has to include a victim assistance strategy. And reminding you of what those 16 best practices are. So a comprehensive plan is going to incorporate all of the 16 best practices. So just to be reminded of those. And if you want to put together a plan in your community, you can go to the website here, or you can take a picture of this QR code, and that will take you to the application, and you can apply to have any of us or somebody else come to your community to help you put together your plan. And there are the recorded webinar trainings of some of the things that we spoke about that are available at the ICPTTA.com website, or there can be a training customized for your community in a particular topic by going to the website here. I hope that this information has been helpful to you. Here's the contact information for all of us today, and we really appreciate your time and attention. I don't know if we're going to be allowed to take any questions since we are 1 minute over already, or if there are any questions. If we're not, if you want to email any of us with any of the questions, we'll be happy to respond. I mean, you could just put us all in one, or pick out one of us, and we'll get back to you with questions. So thank you so much for your time and attention today.
So Krista, really quickly, the one question that came in was, how do we know if our community already has a plan in place? Who should they go to ask?
So if for a victim, well, there are a couple of places. So the first place you want to start to see what is your emergency response plan or your incident command plan is you want to find out who is your emergency manager in your community. And so you want to go to your emergency manager and say, hey, what's your emergency response plan? And is there a victim response plan that's a part of this? Who is the incident commander in your community, which is either going to be your police chief or your local sheriff or maybe your fire chief, and asking them also, is there a victim response plan? And if there isn't, then that's where you kind of sell the idea that, hey, well, guess what? We should probably have one, and assure them that it's not to, it's only to supplement, it's not to replace the plan that they have in existence. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have right now. So
Okay, great.
Well, thank you all so much. We certainly at PCCD appreciate your time and being able to share your wisdom. Again, we're hoping that nobody has to use this in the future in their community, but we are grateful of your experience and level of expertise that you can bring and help us for future planning. So thank you, everybody. This will end the broadcast of this presentation.
Thank you. Have a great conference.
Thanks.
Thanks.